Christopher Nolan is known for astounding audiences with the depth of his films. Not only are they incredible cinematic spectacles, but each of them holds a complexity unique to Nolan's aesthetic. It's rare to find a big Hollywood director who is capable of creating brilliant crowd pleasers while still communicating such an involved message. That thematic voice permeates Nolan's work and has gained him a cult following that watches his movies not just for their scope or cinematography, but for the philosophy Nolan carries with him into every film. A fan of this director might go into each of his movies looking for a new perspective on the same question. Is there an objective reality, and are we capable of knowing it? Nolan's characters constantly struggle with the search for this truth, and each of them is limited by a finite perspective. In Following, the protagonist follows strangers, trying to find the truth of another person's experience. In Memento, Leonard Shelby is constantly forgetting his own life and must find a way to remind himself of facts he cannot know. And in Inception, Cobb has to decide if a dream is valuable enough to live as reality. Oppenheimer is no exception to this rule, though it deals with it in a different way. In order to understand the philosophical message Christopher Nolan is trying to communicate, first we have to understand the difference between objective and subjective truth. The concept of objectivity presumes that there exists an external reality that remains true regardless of our perception or opinions of it. It's what Immanuel Kant refers to as the noumenal world rather than the phenomenal world, with the notion that there is a reality, the thing in itself, outside one's perception of it. Subjectivism is the argument that no such objective truth exists because everything we know is based on personal experience and thus becomes altered. It's a kind of solipsism and Cartesian skepticism that claims everyone's reality is different and there is no absolute truth. These are the yin and yang that make up every Christopher Nolan film. Memento may be the best example of this idea that many Nolan fans have seen. In Memento, the main character is neurologically incapable of forming new memories. Using photos, tattoos, and other methods of reminding himself of facts, he attempts to track down his wife's murderer. Nolan essentially uses the most unreliable narrator possible to tell you a detective story in reverse. And the conclusion he leads you to isn't that the crime has been solved, but rather that this character must trick himself into believing his own evidence. Essentially, because of his condition, he must lie in order to find the truth. As he says in the film, "I have to believe in a world outside my own mind. I have to believe that my actions still have meaning, even if I can't remember them. I have to believe that when my eyes are closed, the world's still here." And, in an ironic twist of fate, he creates that world outside his mind, only to have it lead him to the wrong conclusion. This is quintessential Nolan philosophy, that the world in front of our eyes may lead us astray, but we have no choice but to trust it anyway. It's the message that Nolan brings with him into every one of his movies. In The Prestige, Christian Bale's character makes a living out of tricking people, but soon begins to believe that magic might actually exist as Hugh Jackman performs miracles that only he can explain. Inception follows a man trying to plant ideas in other people's dreams, but he soon finds himself too overpowered by his own subconscious to actually accept an external reality. Nolan does the same thing moralistically in The Dark Knight. When Batman confronts the Joker at the end of the film, two groups of people on two separate ferries have the power to blow each other up. It's referred to as the prisoner's dilemma. Do you trust another person enough not to betray them yourself? In order for Batman to prove to the Joker there is good in humanity and to save both groups of people, he must let them save themselves. He has to occupy himself with the Joker's hostage situation and trust the people on the ferries will survive. He must take a leap of faith to know that good exists outside of this war he has with the Joker. Nolan does something similar in Interstellar. A group of scientists struggle against nature to preserve the human race, but as the plot progresses, we discover that preservation means different things to different characters. People lie to save themselves, or to convince people to keep working on a doomed plan. Nolan takes a look at empathy as Cooper has to choose between being a father to his daughter or saving all of humanity. The conflict extends to every character as self-preservation becomes a force for good and evil. As Dr. Mann says, "We can care deeply, selflessly about those we know, but that empathy rarely extends beyond our line of sight. And that becomes the justification for him and Professor Brand to lie. Each character's personal experience determines how they respond when confronted with their own mortality and the mortality of the human race. Not just nature, but human nature is both the enemy and the ally in this movie. The fates of many are decided by each and every individual in the film. Moving from the future to the past, this theme of self-preservation continues into Dunkirk. The story of the Great World War II evacuation is told from 3 different perspectives, and, in true Christopher Nolan fashion, it plays with time by being set over 1 week, 1 day, and 1 hour. As the Nazis surround the few remaining Allied soldiers in France, they must fight tooth and nail to survive. Every second of the film is filled with suspense as it follows the uncertainty of every individual soldier's survival, because we know to survive is to win. We know that, despite the knowledge that the world will trick you, that others will trick you, that you can't even trust yourself, despite all of that, simply to exist is a victory against evil. Oppenheimer sees many of these themes aggregated into one film. Like Dunkirk, it is written from a story we already know. These are 2 historical fictions that Nolan has written, and both of them are perhaps where he excelled the most. That's because Nolan didn't make either of these movies to relay the stories of their historical events. We already know how both of these tales ended. Dunkirk's suspense didn't come from the question of an Allied victory, and the massive nuclear explosion wasn't the climax of Oppenheimer. Instead, that story was framed by a conflict between Robert Oppenheimer and Louis Strauss. Both men are being interviewed sometime after World War II, and oddly enough, both men are working to undo Oppenheimer's legacy. Strauss is struggling to ruin Oppenheimer for political gain, and Oppenheimer is attempting to dissuade people from using his own invention. Nolan makes it clear to us that the motive to construct the nuclear bomb is based on the worry that the Nazis are already doing the same thing. Unlike the 2 fairies in The Dark Knight, humanity doesn't trust itself and has chosen to destroy each other. And to add another layer to this message, Nolan shows us how this competition between Oppenheimer and Strauss still ends in, as they said in The Atomic Age, mutually assured destruction. This need to survive is so great that it leads us to destroy each other. There's a point in the movie where Nolan shows us that, when developing the nuclear bomb, scientists theorized that it was possible they could create a chain reaction that would ignite the atmosphere, annihilating everything. But they chose to keep building the bomb anyway. Nolan shows us that when this fear exists beyond our line of sight, we refuse to take a leap of faith, and thus risk destroying ourselves. Nolan uses this chain reaction as a metaphor. At the end of the film, Oppenheimer tells Einstein that perhaps he did begin the series of events that would end the world. He also begins the film with the story of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave man the tool it needed to destroy itself. Nolan's philosophy has integrated here to form Oppenheimer. Over his career, he has shown us that there is no objective truth or morality, that everything we know is known through the filter of our own perception. I have to believe that when my eyes are closed, the world's still there. Memento. But even if truth is unknowable, Nolan assures us that we must keep fighting. This city just showed you that it's full of people ready to believe in good. The Dark Knight. Even if that fight might seem impossible. But that empathy rarely extends beyond our line of sight. Interstellar. Because the enemy we're fighting is the unknown. They won't fear it until they understand it, and they won't understand it until they've used it. Oppenheimer. And so, Christopher Nolan asks each one of us, do you want to take a leap of faith, or become an old man filled with regret, waiting to die alone? Inception.